Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. This week, are restricted gears the answer to pro cycling safety problems? Wout van Aert seems to think so. I'll be looking into how that might work, as well as wrapping up the cyclocross action from the holidays, in which Van Aert returned to winning ways. This week in the world of racing, we learnt that Visma Lease bike will look almost exactly the same in 2025 as they did in 2024. This is how their kit will look this year. Spot the difference, anyone? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, as they say. Meanwhile, Intermarché have revealed their new kit, and whilst you couldn't describe it as a radical departure from 2024, that red arm certainly stands out, which was a deliberate move by the designers. And anything that makes it easier to differentiate between the teams and riders is a good thing, in my opinion, so it's a thumbs up from me. And finally, we learnt that Wout van Aert is back to winning ways. 123 days after crashing out of La Vuelta with a serious knee injury, Van Aert raised his arms victorious at the Super Prestige in Gullegem, and 24 hours later he did exactly the same thing at the World Cup in Dendermonde. Now unfortunately, we didn't get to see a duel with Mathieu van der Poel at those races. The Dutchman crashed in Luenhout just after Christmas, and despite winning the World Cup in Besançon 2 days after that, lingering rib pain has been bad enough for him to skip a couple of planned races. But either way, fantastic to see Van Aert back. 2024 was, in many respects, a season to forget for him. He crashed out of the Classics, then he crashed out of La Vuelta just as he got back to top form. And it was those crashes which, in part, probably got Van Aert thinking about safety in the peloton. Speaking to Sportser recently, Van Aert said that limiting gearing could be one way to increase safety and reduce crashes in the peloton. Why? Because riders now have the option to run much larger gears without compromising their setup for climbs or the jump between consecutive ratios. 20 years ago, you'd rarely see a gear bigger than 53/11 in pro road racing, but now we're seeing a 54-tooth front chainring as pretty much standard, and sometimes larger than that. And then teams using SRAM, who have a 10-tooth cog, can still sometimes have a 52-tooth front chainring. That ratio is even bigger than 55/11. So if you push 52/10 at 110 revs per minute, you'll be travelling at over 73 kilometers per hour if you're running 28mm tyres. And it's here where Van Aert feels there's been a change, one which is making the sport more dangerous. He accepts that he himself is guilty of this, pedalling at very high speeds to improve position ahead of a crucial point in a race because you can. His argument is that if there was a restriction on the biggest gears you're allowed to race with, riders wouldn't have the option of pedalling in very high speed situations because the ratio simply wouldn't allow it. Seems like a decent idea, doesn't it? But in reality, I'm not sure how much difference it would really make. I mean, you couldn't restrict the gears too much, otherwise sprinters won't be able to sprint. Let's say the UCI caps the ratio at the old 53/11. On the same tyres at the same RPM of 110, that's 68 kilometers per hour, a speed that riders regularly reach in sprint finishes. But that's only 5 kilometers per hour slower than the biggest ratios currently used. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe that 5 k's per h would make all the difference to safety. Or maybe riders would just pedal at higher cadence, making things even sketchier than they already were. You can let me know what you think of Van Aert's suggestion in the comments section below, but whatever you think about that specifically, I think we can all agree that it's a good thing that this subject is being talked about. Safety in pro races is a big issue. Riders are still dying in UCI sanctioned races, and in this era, that is simply not good enough. The discussion needs to be had, and having riders as high profile as Van Aert adding to the discussion will hopefully help lead to positive changes now, before the next catastrophe, not as a consequence of it. Now, the one thing that most people seem to agree on is that the sport does need to slow down. Equipment and rider level means that the speeds have never been higher, but on roads that are increasingly designed to slow traffic down. The only problem is that nobody's come up with a universally acceptable way of slowing the peloton down. Now, there are people who say that artificially slowing things down goes against the whole ethos of the sport, which is to go from A to B as fast as possible, or at least be crossing the finish line first. But in answer to those people, I would say that there are already measures in place to slow things down. The recent bans on the aero tuck and bum on top tube positions, the ban on spinacci bars many years ago, etc. If regulations on bikes and position weren't in place, we'd have a bunch of sprinters doing 100 km/h on recumbents. Can you imagine that sort of carnage? Anyway, back to racing, and there's quite a lot to go over from the Christmas period. With Van der Poel and Van Aert back though, the other male stars haven't really got a look in when they've been on the start line. Thankfully for them though, there were a couple of races where they weren't. Elisabeth won on New Year's Day at the Grand Prix Sven Nys in Basel, whilst Laurens Sweeck took the spoils a couple of days later in Koksijde. Sweeck had also won the Super Prestige in Degen just before the end of 2024, so it was a very good holiday period for him. Not that you can call it a holiday. In the women's, things have been much more open this year. Fem van Empel just hasn't dominated as she did last season, which has left the door open to others. Puk Pieter took her first win of the season in Koksijde last Friday, beating Brandt and Van Empel. That brought to an end a winning streak from Van Empel, who finished first in Gavre, Besançon and Basel between Boxing Day and New Year's Day. For me though, Lucinda Brandt has been the standout rider this season so far. She's competed in 24 races and not once has she finished off the podium. Over the weekend she took wins in Hullegum and Dendermonde, and she currently leads all three major series by a considerable margin, the UCI World Cup, X2O and Super Prestige. Brandt was pushed pretty close by young Zoe Bagstedt on Saturday in Hullegum though, so maybe, just maybe, there might be a blot on the Dutch stranglehold of women's cyclocross in the not too distant future. There's going to be a bit of a break in international cyclocross now, as this weekend there are a whole heap of national championships taking place through Europe and beyond. You'll be able to watch a couple of those live on Discovery Plus and Max, which are the same platforms where you'll be able to watch a full season of bike racing in 2025. The Women's Tour Down Under is now just 11 days away. Can you believe it? Some other bits of news to wrap up things now. Lotto and Israel Premier Tech have both decided not to compete at Paris-Nice this March. Both teams received invitations by virtue of their ranking in the Pro Division, but both refused. Why? Apparently because they want to focus on maximising how many UCI points they can win. Now, looking at the calendar this year, there aren't a huge number of races running at the same time as Paris-Nice, just Tirreno Adriatico really, which is another World Tour level race in Italy. However, the week after, there are a heap of one-day races in Belgium and France. Two of those are .pro races. Win one of those and you get more points than winning 3 stages of Paris-Nice. Win both, as someone like Arnaud Delis could foreseeably do, and you'll get as many points as you would do finishing second overall at Paris-Nice. So you can see the rationale behind it, but it does highlight a big problem with the current point system. Anyway, those two teams will be replaced in Paris-Nice by Uno X and Tudor Pro Cycling. Mona Mitterwallner, one of the most talented mountain bikers on the international circuit, will combine that with road racing for the foreseeable future. She's signed with Human Powered Health for this year and next. She's an incredible climber, so it's going to be very interesting to see how well she fares over on the road. XDS-Astana have signed 24-year-old Haoyu Su for their team for the next 2 years. The Chinese rider picked up a couple of decent results at the Tour of Qinghai Lake a couple of years ago. And although his results in the last 2 seasons haven't been so impressive, the team obviously needed to sign a couple of Chinese riders at the wishes of their new headline sponsor. Unfortunately for Gleb Syriza, that means that he's been demoted to their development squad, which is a real shame for him. He's been more than a decent rider over the last couple of years, but the news probably came too late for him to find a place elsewhere in the World Tour. Incidentally, if you'd like to see our exclusive first look at the XDS bike that the team will be racing on this year, just head over to GCN Tech and you'll find it there. Sticking with signings, Q36.5 have signed another Pidcock. Tom is joined there by his younger brother Joe. The 22-year-old spent the last couple of years with Trinity Racing, who wrapped up their road operations at the end of last year. Ben Hermans is retired after 16 years as a pro rider. He took 19 wins in that time, including 4 overall stage race titles, whilst Tobias Ludvigsson, who's been pro for 13 years, has also hung up his wheels. I'm going to finish the racing news show this week with some sad news. Gianni Savio, a legend of the sport, passed away on the 30th of December at the age of 76. Savio was a larger-than-life character, very well known in Italian cycling circles, and he'll also be a familiar name and voice to those of you who listen to the cycling podcast. He'd been involved in the running of pro cycling teams since the mid-80s, most recently with the Sellitalia squad, which is where Egan Bernal made his name. but now instead it was amongst a large number of Colombians and South Americans really, who were given an opportunity by Savio to race at the highest level in Europe. Rest in peace, Gianni, and thanks for all you did for cycling. That is all for this week's show. I'll be back to wrap up all the racing news again in a week's time, so I'll see you then. A speed that riders regularly reach in Insta. XDS-Astana have signed 24-year-old Haoyu Su from their team tour.